as you'll remember, the last time we saw the Baudelaires, they were taken by Count Olaf's henchmen and told that they were going to be in the play. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
See.
As Violet and Klaus Baudelaire stood still in their nightgown and pajamas backstage at Count Olaf's theater, they were of two minds. A phrase which here means they felt two different ways at the same time. On one hand, they were of course filled with dread. From the murmur of the voices they heard on the stage, the two Baudelaire orphans could tell that the performance of The Marvelous Marriage had begun, and it seemed too late to do anything to foil Count Olaf's plan. On the other hand, however, they were fascinated as they had never been backstage at a theatrical production and when there was much to see. Put your finger on the word see. Now, I know some of you are new to the school, but those of you who were here in 4th grade and 3rd grade, probably 3rd grade is the one I'm thinking of more, where we did A Christmas Carol. Some of you did A Christmas Carol and others of you did Mary Poppins. Do you remember that? Do you remember going backstage?
Yes.
Was it like calm and serene and quiet?
No.
It was boring. There were people like running all over, right?
Yeah.
There were people with flashlights
Yeah.
going backstage. There was props and scenery moving. There were actors and actresses coming off the main stage and like doing quick, dropping off a prop and picking up another prop or running to the back to change their costume or redo their makeup. Do you remember that? That's what the Baudelaire children were seeing, which is kind of cool to step back and watch. If you ever have the opportunity to be backstage, like it's a cool experience. Members of Count Olaf's theater troupe hurried this way and that, too busy to even glance at the children. 3 very short men were carrying a large flat piece of wood, painted to look like a living room. The 2 white-faced women were arranging flowers in a vase that from far away appeared to be marble, but close up looked more like cardboard. An important-looking man with the warts all over his face was adjusting an enormous light fixtures. As the children peeked on stage, they could see Count Olaf in his fancy suit, declaiming some lines from the play just as the curtain came down, controlled by a woman with very short hair who was pulling on a long rope attached to a pulley. Despite their fear, you see, the 2 older Baudelaires were also very interested in what was going on, and only wish they were not involved in any way. As the curtain fell, Count Olaf strode off stage and looked at the children. "It's the end of Act 2. Why aren't the orphans in their costumes?" he hissed at the 2 white-faced women. Then, as the audience broke into applause, his angry expression turned to one of joy, and he walked back on stage. Gesturing to the short-haired woman to raise the curtain, he strode to the exact center of the stage and took elaborate bows as the curtain came up. He waved and blew kisses to the audience as the curtain came down again, and then his face once again filled with anger. "Intermission is only 10 minutes, he said, and then the children must perform. Get them into their costumes quickly." Without a word, the 2 white-faced women grabbed Violet Klaus by the wrist and led them into a dressing room. The room was dusty but shiny, covered in mirrors and tiny lights so the actors could see better to put on their makeup and wigs. And there were people calling out to one another and laughing as they changed their clothes. One white-faced woman yanked Violet's arms up and pulled her nightgown off over her head and thrust a dirty, lacy white gown and dress to put on her. Klaus, meanwhile, had his pajamas removed by the other white-faced woman and was hurriedly stuffed into a blue sailor suit that itched and made him look like a toddler. "Isn't this exciting?" said a voice, and the children turned to see Justice Strauss, all dressed up in her judge's robes and powdered wig. She was clutching a small book. "You children look wonderful." "So do you," Klaus said. "What's the book?" "Why, those are my lines," Justice Strauss said. "Count Olaf told me to bring a law book and read the real wedding ceremony in order to make the play as realistic as possible." "All you have to do, Violet, say I do. But I have to make quite the speech. This is going to be fun." "You know that would be fun," Violet said carefully, "is if you changed your lines around just a little." Klaus's face lit up. "Yes, Justice Strauss, be creative. There's no reason to stick to the legal ceremony. It's not as if it's a real wedding." Justice Strauss frowned. "I don't know about that, children," she said. "I think it would be best to follow Count Olaf's instructions. After all, he's in charge." "Justice Strauss," a voice called. "Justice Strauss, please report to the makeup artist." Oh my word, I get to wear makeup," Justice Strauss had on a dreamy expression, as if she were about to be crowned queen instead of just having some powder and creams smeared on her face. "Children, I must go. See you on stage, my dears. Just as Strauss ran off, leaving the children to finish changing to their costumes. One of the white-faced women put on a flowered headdress on Violet, who realized in horror that the dress she had changed into was a bridal gown. The other woman put a sailor cap on Klaus, who gazed in one of the mirrors, astonished at how ugly he looked. His eyes met those of Violet, who was looking at the mirror as well. What can we do? Klaus said quietly. Pretend to be sick? Maybe they'd call off the performance. Count Olaf would know what we were up to, Violet replied glumly. Act 3 of The Marvelous Marriage by Al Funkloot is about to begin, a man with a clipboard shouted. Everyone, please get to your place for Act 3. The actors rushed out of the room, and the white-faced woman grabbed the children and hustled out after them. The backstage area was in complete pandemonium, a word which here means actors and stagehands running around to tend to last-minute details. The bald man with the long nose hurried by the children and then stopped himself, looked at Violet in her wedding dress, and smirked. No funny stuff, he said to them, waggling a bony finger. Remember, when you go out there, just do exactly what you're supposed to do. Count Olaf will be holding his walkie-talkie during the entire act, and if you do even one thing wrong, he'll be giving Sonny a call up there in the tower. Yes, Klaus said bitterly. He was tired of being threatened in the same way over and over. You'd better do exactly as planned, the man said. I'm sure they will, a voice said suddenly. And the children turned to see Mr. Poe, dressed very formally and accompanied by his wife. He smiled at the children and came over to shake at their hand. Polly and I just want to tell you to break a leg. What? Klaus said, alarmed. That's the theater term, Mr. Poe explained, meaning good luck on tonight's performance. I'm glad that you children have adjusted to life with your new father and are participating in family activities. Mr. Poe, Klaus said quickly, Violet and I have something to tell you. It's very important. What is it? Mr. Poe said. Yes, said Count Olaf. What is it that you have to tell Mr. Poe, children? Count Olaf had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, and his shiny eyes glared at the children meaningfully. In one hand, Violet and Klaus could see he held a walkie-talkie. Just that we appreciate all you've done for us, Mr. Poe, Klaus said weakly. That's all we wanted to say. Of course, Mr. Poe said, patting him on the back. Well, Polly and I had better take our seats. Break a leg, Baudelaires. I wish we could break a leg, Klaus whispered to Violet, and Mr. Poe left. You will, soon enough, Count Olaf said, pushing the two children toward the stage. Other actors were milling about, finding their place for Act 3, and just as Strauss was off in a corner, practicing her lines from her law book. Klaus took a look around the stage, wondering if anyone could help. The bald man with a long nose took Klaus's hand and led him to one side. You and I will stand here for the duration of the act. That means the whole thing. I know what the word duration means, Klaus said. No nonsense, the bald man said. Klaus watched his sister in her wedding gown take her place next to Count Olaf as the curtain rose. Klaus heard applause from the audience as Act 3 of The Marvelous Marriage began. It will be of no interest to you if I describe the action in this insipid, the word insipid here means dull and foolish, play by Al Funkloot. His was a dreadful play, and of no real importance to our story. Various actors and actresses performed very dull dialogue and moved around the set as Klaus tried to make eye contact with them to see if they would help. He soon realized that this play must have been chosen merely as an excuse for Olaf's evil plan, not for its entertainment value, as he sensed the audience losing interest and moving around in their seats. Klaus turned his attention to the audience to see if any of them would notice something was afoot. But the way the wart-faced man had arranged the lights prevented Klaus from seeing faces in the auditorium, and he could only make the dim outline of people in the audience. Put your finger on audience. If you've ever been on stage before, eyes this way. If you've ever been on stage before, when you look out, it can be really hard to see people in the audience because the lights are really, really bright in your eyes. Have you noticed that? That's what they're talking about here. Now, from my years of talent show hosting experience, Dante, fingers crossed when we get the talent show this year, because it is something to behold. But confetti cannons are my favorite. But that's why I have to come off the stage sometimes when I'm introducing people, because if the lights are on, I can't see the people I'm introducing. Does that make sense? Like, it's just too bright in your eyes. So if you've ever performed on a stage before, that's what they're talking about. Does that make sense? It's not necessarily even the way the man had arranged the lights, it's just the way the lights are typically arranged when you're on stage. Count Olaf had a great number of very long speeches, which he performed with elaborate gestures and facial expressions. No one seemed to notice that he held a walkie-talkie the entire time. Finally, Justice Strauss began speaking, and Klaus saw that she was reading directly from a legal book. Her eyes were sparkling, her face flushed as she performed on stage for the first time. Too starstruck to realize she was part of Olaf's plan, she spoke on and on about Olaf and Violet's care for each other in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, and all of those things that are said to many people who decide for one reason or another to get married. When she finished her speech, Justice Strauss turned to Count Olaf and asked, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Count Olaf said, smiling. Klaus saw Violet shudder. "Do you," Justice Strauss said, turning to Violet, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Violet said. Klaus clenched his fist. His sister had said "I do" in the presence of a judge. Once she signed the official document, the wedding was legally valid. And now Klaus could see that Justice Strauss was taking a document from the other actors and holding out to Violet to sign. "Don't move an inch," the bald man muttered to Klaus, and Klaus thought of poor Sonny dangling at the top of the tower and stood still as he watched Violet take a long quill pen from Count Olaf. Violet's eyes were wide as she looked down at the document, and her face was pale, and her left hand was trembling as she signed her name. What, honey? What hand was trembling?
Her left hand.
Her left hand was trembling as she signed her name.
Is she a lefty?
She's nervous.
No, she's not a lefty. She's a righty. Maybe she's nervous.
I think she is.
Yeah, there's been a lot of emphasis in the book about her using her right hand for everything, hasn't there been? Huh. Maybe she got nervous and forgot, yeah. Chapter 13. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Count Olaf said, stepping forward to address the audience, I have an announcement. There is no reason to continue tonight's performance, for its purpose has been served. This has not been a scene of fiction. My marriage to Violet Baudelaire is perfectly legal, and now I am in control of her entire fortune. There were gasps from the audience, and some of the actors looked at one another in shock. Not everyone apparently had known about Olaf's plan. "That can't be," Justice Strauss cried. "The marriage laws in this community are quite simple," Count Olaf said. "The bride must say 'I do' in the presence of a judge like yourself and sign the explanatory document. And all of you," Count Olaf gestured to the audience, "are witnesses." "But Violet is only a child," one of the actors said. "She's not old enough to marry." "She is if her legal guardian agrees," Count Olaf said. "And in addition to being her husband, I am her legal guardian." "But that piece of paper is not an official document," Justice Strauss said. "That's just a stage prop." Count Olaf took the paper from Violet's hand and gave it to Justice Strauss. "I think if you look at it closely, you will see it's an official document from City Hall." Justice Strauss took the document in her hand and read it quickly. Then closing her eyes, she sighed deeply and furrowed her brow, thinking hard. Klaus watched her and wondered if this were the expression Justice Strauss had on her face whenever she was serving in the High Court. "You're right," she said finally to Count Olaf. "This marriage, unfortunately, is completely legal." Violet said "I do," and signed her name here on the paper. "Count Olaf, you are Violet's husband, and therefore in complete control of her estate." "That can't be," said a voice from the audience, and Klaus recognized it as Mr. Poe. He ran up the stairs to the stage and took the document from Justice Strauss. "This is dreadful nonsense." "I'm afraid this dreadful nonsense is the law," Justice Strauss said. Her eyes were filling up with tears. "I can't believe how easily I was tricked," she said. "I would never do anything to harm you children, never." "You were easily tricked," Count Olaf said, grinning, and the judge began to cry. "It was child's play winning this fortune. Now, if all of you will excuse me, my bride and I need to go out home for our wedding night." "First, let Sonny go," Klaus burst out. "You promised to let her go." "Where is Sonny?" Mr. Poe asked. "She's all tied up at the moment," Count Olaf said, "if you'll pardon our little joke." His eyes shone as he pressed buttons on the walkie-talkie and waited while the hook-handed man answered. "Hello? Yes, of course it's me, you idiot. Everything is going according to plan. Please remove Sonny from her cage and bring her directly to the theater. Klaus and Sonny have some chores to do before they go to bed." Count Olaf gave Klaus a sharp look. "Are you satisfied now?" "Yes," Klaus said quietly. He wasn't satisfied at all, of course, but at least his baby sister was no longer dangling from a tower. "Don't think you're so safe," the bald man whispered to Klaus. "Count Olaf will take care of you and your sisters later. He doesn't want to do it in front of all these people." He did not have to explain to Klaus what he meant by the phrase "take care of." "Well, I'm not satisfied at all," Mr. Poe said. "This is absolutely horrendous. This is completely monstrous. This is financially dreadful. I'm afraid, however, Kanalov said, that it is legally binding. Tomorrow, Mr. Poe, I shall come to the bank and withdraw the complete Baudelaire fortune. Mr. Poe opened his mouth as if to say something, but began to cough instead. For several seconds, he coughed into a handkerchief while everyone waited for him to speak. I won't allow it, Mr. Poe finally gasped, wiping his mouth. I absolutely will not allow it. I'm afraid you have to, Kanalov replied. I'm afraid Olaf is right, Justice Strauss said through her tears. This marriage is legally binding. Begging your pardon, Violet said suddenly, but I think you may be wrong. Everyone turned to look at the eldest Baudelaire orphan. What did you say, Countess? Olaf said. I'm not your Countess, Violet said testily. A word here which means, in an extremely annoyed tone, at least I don't think I am. And why is that? I did not sign the document in my own hand, as the law states, Violet said. What do you mean we all saw you? Count Olaf's eyebrows beginning to rise in anger. I'm afraid your husband is right, dear, Justice Strauss said sadly. There's no use denying it. There were too many witnesses. Like most people, Violet said, I am right-handed. But I signed the document with my left hand. What? Count Olaf cried. He snatched the paper from Justice Strauss and looked at it. His eyes were shining very bright. You are a liar, he hissed at Violet. No, she's not, Klaus said excitedly. I remember because I watched her left hand trembling as she signed her name. It is impossible to prove, Count Olaf said. If you like, Violet said, I shall be happy to sign my name again on a separate sheet of paper with my right hand and then my left. And then we can see which signature the one on the document most resembles. A small detail like which hand you used to sign, Count Olaf said, doesn't matter in the least. If you don't mind, sir, Mr. Poe said, I'd like Justice Strauss to make that decision. Everyone looked at Justice Strauss, who was wiping away the last of her tears. Let me see, she said quietly and closed her eyes again. She sighed deeply, and the Baudelaire orphans and all who liked them held their breath as Justice Strauss furrowed her brow, thinking hard on the situation. Finally, she smiled. If Violet is indeed right-handed, she said carefully, and she signed the document with her left hand, then it follows that the signature does not fulfill the requirements of nuptial law. The law clearly states that the document must be signed in the bride's own hand. Therefore, it can be concluded that this marriage is invalid. Violet, you are not a countess, and Count Olaf, you are not in control of the Baudelaire fortune. Hooray! Cried a voice from the audience, and several people applauded. Unless you are a lawyer, it will probably strike you as odd that Count Olaf's plan was defeated by Violet signing with her left hand instead of her right. But the law is an odd thing. For instance, one country in Europe has a law that requires all of its bakers to sell bread at the exact same price. A certain island has laws that forbid anyone from removing its fruit. And a town, not too far from where you live, has a law which bars me from coming within 5 miles of its borders. Had Violet signed the marriage contract with her right hand, the law would have made her a miserable contessa. But because she signed with her left hand, she remained, to her relief, a miserable orphan. What was good news to Violet and her siblings, of course, was bad news to Count Olaf. Nevertheless, he gave everyone a grim smile. In that case, he said to Violet, pushing a button on the walkie-talkie, you will either marry me again, and correctly this time, or I will... Nepo! Sunny's unmistakable voice rang out over Count Olaf's, and she tottered on stage toward her siblings. The hook-handed man following behind her, his walkie-talkie buzzing and crackling. Count Olaf was too late. Sunny, you're safe, Klaus cried, and embraced her. Violet rushed over, and the two older Baudelaires fussing over the youngest ones. Somebody bring her something to eat, Violet said. She must be very hungry after hanging in a tower window all that time. Cake! Sunny shrieked. Arrgh! Count Olaf roared. Began to pace back and forth like an animal in a cage, pausing only to point a finger at Violet. You may not be my wife, he said, but you're still my daughter, and do you honestly think, Mr. Poe said in an exasperated voice, that I will allow you to continue to care for these 3 children after the treachery I've seen here tonight? The orphans are mine, Count Olaf insisted, and with me they shall stay. There's nothing illegal about trying to marry someone. There is something illegal about dangling an infant out of a tower window, Justice Strauss said indignantly. You, Count Olaf, will go to jail, and the 3 children will live with me. Arrest him, a voice from the audience. And other people took up the cry, send him to jail! He's an evil man! And give us back our money! It was a lousy play. Mr. Poe took Count Olaf's arm. After a brief eruption of coughs, announced in a harsh voice, I hereby arrest you in the name of the law. Oh, Justice Strauss, Violet said, do you really mean what you said? Can we really live with you? Of course I mean minute, Justice Strauss said. I am very fond of you children. I feel responsible for your welfare. Can we use your library every day? Klaus asked. Can we work in the garden? Violet said. Cake! Sunny shrieked again, and everyone laughed. At this point in the story, I feel obliged to interrupt and give you one last warning. As I said at the very beginning of the book, the book you are holding in your hands does not have a happy ending. It may appear now that Count Olaf will go to jail and the three Baudelaire youngsters will live happily ever after with Justice Strauss, but it is not so. If you like, you may shut the book at this instant and not read the unhappy ending that is to follow. You may spend the rest of your life believing that the Baudelaire triumphed over Count Olaf and live the rest of their lives in the house and library of Justice Strauss, but that is not how the story goes. For as everyone was laughing at Sunny's cry for cake, the important-looking man with all the warts on his face was sneaking toward the controls for the lighting of the theater. Quick as a wink, the man flickered off the main switch so that all the lights went off and everyone was standing in darkness. Instantly, pandemonium ensued, as everyone ran this way and that, shouting at one another. Actors tripped over members of the audience. Members of the audience tripped over theatrical props. Mr. Poe grabbed his wife thinking it was Count Olaf. Klaus grabbed Sunny and held her up as high as he could so she would get hurt. But Violet knew at once what had happened, and made her way carefully to where she remembered the lights had been. When the play was being performed, Violet had watched the light controls carefully, taking mental notes in case these devices came in handy for an invention. She was certain she could find the switch she could turn it back on. Her arms stretched out in front of her as if she were blind. Violet made her way across the stage, stepping carefully around the piece of furniture and startled actors. In the darkness, Violet looked like a ghost, her white wedding gown moving slowly across the stage. Then, just as she reached the switch, Violet felt a hand on her shoulder. A figure leaned in to whisper in her ear. I'll get my hands on your fortune if it's the last thing I do, the voice hissed. And when I have it, I'll kill you and your siblings with my own two hands. Violet gave a little cry of terror, but flicked the switch on. The entire theater was flooded with light. Everyone blinked and looked around. Mr. Poe looked over his wife. Klaus put Sunny down. But nobody was touching Violet's shoulder. Count Olaf was gone. Where did he go? Mr. Poe shouted. Where did they all go? The Baudelaire youngsters looked around and saw that not only had Count Olaf vanished, but his accomplices, the wart-faced man, the hook-handed man, the bald man with the long nose, the enormous person who looked like neither a man nor a woman, and the two white-faced women had vanished along with him. They must have run outside, Klaus said, while it was dark. Mr. Poe led the way outside, and Justice Strauss and the children followed. Way down the block, they could see a long black car driving away into the night. Maybe it contained Count Olaf and his associates, maybe it didn't. But in any case, it turned a corner and disappeared into the dark city as the children watched without a word. Blast it, Mr. Poe said, they're gone. But don't worry, children, we'll catch them. I'm going to call the police immediately. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked at one another and knew it wasn't that simple as Mr. Poe had said. Count Olaf would take care to stay out of sight as he planned his next move. He was far too clever to be captured by the likes of Mr. Poe. Well, let's go home, children, Justice Strauss said. We can worry about this in the morning when I fix you a good breakfast. Mr. Poe coughed. Wait a minute, he said, looking down the floor. I'm sorry to tell you this, children, but I cannot allow you to be raised by someone who is not a relative. What? Violet cried. After all Justice Strauss has done for us? We would never figure out Count Olaf's plan without her and her library, Klaus said. Without Justice Strauss, we would have lost our lives. That may be so, Mr. Poe said, and I thank Justice Strauss for her generosity. But your parents' will is very specific. You must be adopted by a relative. Tonight you will stay with me in my home, and tomorrow I shall go to the bank and figure out what it is to do with you. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. The children looked at Justice Strauss, who sighed heavily and hugged each of the Baudelaire youngsters in turn. Mr. Poe is right, she said sadly. He must respect your parents' wishes. Don't you want to do what your parents wanted, children? Violet, Klaus, and Sunny pictured their loving parents, and wished more than ever that the fire had not occurred. Never had they felt so alone. They wanted very badly to live with the kind and generous woman, but they knew that it simply could not be done. I guess you're right, Justice Strauss said finally. We will miss you very much. I will miss you too, she said, and her eyes filled with tears once more. Then they each gave Justice Strauss one last embrace, and followed Mr. and Mrs. Poe to their car. The Baudelaire orphans piled into the back seat and peered out the back window at Justice Strauss, who was crying and waving to them. Ahead of them were darkened streets where Count Olaf had escaped to plan more treachery. Behind them was a kind judge who had taken such an interest in the three children. To Violet, Klaus, and Sunny, it seemed that Mr. Poe and the law had made the incorrect decision to take them away from the possibility of a happy life with Justice Strauss and towards an unknown fate with some unknown relative. They didn't understand it, but like so many unfortunate events in life, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it isn't so. The boulders bunched up together against the cold night air, and kept waving out of the back window. The car drove further and further away until Justice Strauss was merely a speck in the darkness, and it seemed that the children they were moving in an apparent, the word apparent here means very, very wrong, and causing much grief direction. So, one of the reasons I picked this book is that it's the first book in the series. There are a lot of books in the series. They're really interesting, and they're kind of shorter reads. So this is worth 4 AR points, but it's a good read. So if you are interested, you can get the other books in the series and keep on finding out what happened to the Baudelaire children.
I just want them to be laid with Justice Strauss.
Right? That would be ideal. All right, in your packet, it's pretty standard today. There's the questions, but for the crossword puzzle, eyes here. For the crossword puzzle, I don't want you to start by writing the word in the squares. I want you to start by writing the word next to the clue. Because what I've seen happen is that if you misspell a word or you copy it wrong, then your crossword puzzle doesn't work out well. So I want you to write the word next to each clue. But that way, if you make a mistake along the way, it's easier to correct. Go ahead and cut this video and get ready because you're going to start the next one.